I'm Larry, and also known as the Old Gazer. This is the Old Gazer channel, which is dedicated to beginning or inexperienced amateur astronomers. And the goal of the channel is to try to give you a little practical information, some advice, and hopefully a little inspiration to help you as you move through the process of becoming an amateur astronomer. So welcome, and with that, let's get started, shall we? This is going to be the second of what is looking more and more like a four-part video series on taking pictures through your telescope using a DSLR camera. Now, if you haven't seen part one, I might suggest that you go back and watch that, because that sort of leads into this part two. I invite you to go back and watch that if you are so inclined. In that video, we talked about why you might want to consider learning how to take pictures through your telescope. And we also then demonstrated how to connect a DSLR camera to a telescope using a T adapter and a T ring. Today we want to talk in more detail about DSLR cameras in the context of how you use one to take pictures through a telescope. Now, some of you know more about this, no doubt, than I do. Some of you already know much of what we're going to say, but there might be some things in here for everybody that might be instructive or useful to you in terms of how you use one of these to take a picture through a telescope. So that's what we're going to do today. I hope I'm going to be relatively coherent in this thing. I'm going to cover quite a bit of information and hopefully a reasonable amount of time. So bear with me and forgive the senior moments that are probably going to arise from time to time as we go through here. This, of course, is a DSLR camera. Now, as discussed last time, many of you probably already have one of those, or some of you may have access to one, or you might be interested in obtaining one, and we talked a little bit about how to do that and what kind of price points you might be looking at in the last video, so no need to cover that same ground again. I want to talk about some aspects, some settings of the DSLR camera that are very important when you seek to take a photograph using this camera through a telescope. And so let's just kind of get right into that and discuss some things that you're going to need to know before you give this a try. First thing you want to make sure with a DSLR camera is that you have it set on manual mode if you're going to take pictures through a telescope. Now, DSLRs have typically several modes available, everything from a purely automatic mode where you don't have to worry about any of the settings on the camera decides all that for you. There are various other modes typically on here that will enable you to take pictures under different circumstances, different conditions. But if you're going to be taking pictures through a telescope, you're going to want to have your camera set on manual mode, and that means you're going to be setting all of the settings on the camera manually. Now, I hope you won't be intimidated or scared off by that. Many people have not used a DSLR in manual mode before, but we're going to talk about the settings that are important and give you an idea of at least a good starting point for all of these settings while it's in manual mode in the video today. So it's not that hard. It's not rocket science. It shouldn't be anything that's intimidating or whatever. It just takes a little bit of knowledge about how to do the settings on the DSLR. Now, so first thing, make sure it's in manual mode. Okay. Now let's talk about three metrics, for lack of a better term, associated with DSLRs, and talk about their significance with respect to taking pictures through a telescope. Let's talk first of all about something called aperture. Now, In the case of a telescope, aperture refers to the diameter of the objective lens or the primary mirror within the telescope. In a camera, aperture is simply this, and I'm going to be very simple in this video. Where I can, I'm going to try to give you the simplest definitions because, as I've said many times on these videos, I'm a simple guy, and if you watch my videos, simple is what you're going to get, and hopefully that's going to work out well, because I presume I'm speaking primarily to beginners who may not know a lot about this. Okay, so what is aperture then in a camera? Well, in the simplest possible terms, aperture is just a hole in the lens that lets light through to strike the sensor of your camera and produce an image. The aperture is contained within the lens of the DSLR camera, and it's a device with blades that can be adjusted to be open to varying degrees. It can be open very wide, or it can be opened very, very small, and of course that will let more or less light in respectively, and allow you to take pictures under different conditions and under different circumstances depending upon what you wish to accomplish. Now, if you're taking pictures of deep sky objects, and by the way, that's the thrust of what we're talking about in these videos. I'm not really going to be talking about taking pictures of the moon or the planets, which is not that hard to do with a camera, because the moon and the planets are just brightly sunlit objects, and you can use more or less normal camera settings to do that and so forth. So most of this discussion is going to be geared towards taking pictures of deep sky objects. And in that case, since you're going to be taking pictures of a very dim object against a dark background, it would make sense that you would want your aperture to be as big as possible, to let in as much light as possible. And that would be true, except when you're taking pictures with a DSLR through a telescope, there's no need to be concerned with aperture, because you're not going to have a lens in the camera. And that's where the diaphragm that sets the aperture is, in the lens. So having said all of that, and having probably already confused you almost before we get started here, you don't need to be concerned about an aperture setting when you're taking pictures through a telescope, because there's not going to be a lens attached to your camera, and you couldn't set the aperture even if you wanted to. So that's easy. You don't have to worry about aperture. Let's move on to the second very important setting that we want to talk about, and that's something called ISO or ISO. Now, some of you have heard it referred to as ISO and some ISO. There is some disagreement. If you research what ISO is or ISO, you'll discover that some people believe that ISO is an acronym that stands for International Standards Organization. And other people believe that it shouldn't be an acronym at all, but it's actually a word, isos, which is a derivative of a Greek word isos, which means equal. So, you know, I say all of that to say that you're going to find researching ISO or ISO to be a little bit of a confusing thing, because there are differences of opinions about what ISO or ISO means, and even about actually how it works and what's the proper way to think about it. But so be careful about that. It's pretty easy to get confused when you're researching it and trying to figure out what it is. Again, I'm going to give you the simplest possible definition of ISO or ISO. And by the way, I'm probably going to refer to it primarily as ISO, because it's just easier to say. And so that's what I'll do. What is ISO? ISO is a camera setting that allows you to brighten or darken your image. It's just that simple. Now, you might say, well, why do you need that kind of a setting on a camera? You can bring your picture into a photo editor like Photoshop or something similar and change the brightness or darken it there. Well, this is not the same kind of brightening or darkening. In this case, you're actually brightening or darkening the image, pardon me, as it's being taken, or shortly after it's being taken, and it will get saved as a brighter or darker image right up front. And then you can further adjust that, of course, in a photo editing program. But that's the way it works. Now, ISO settings on a DSLR typically begin at about 100, which is the darkest ISO setting. And they'll go up to perhaps 1600, 3200, maybe even 6400, or maybe even more, depending upon your camera. My camera, my modest DSLR here, begins at 100 and ends at 3200, and there are stops between those of 200, 400, 800, and 1600. The higher the ISO, the brighter the image. The lower the ISO, the darker the image. So you might reasonably expect from that, if you're going to be taking pictures of deep sky objects, which are very dim objects against a dark background, you're probably going to want to take those pictures with a high ISO setting. And you would be correct for the most part. Now, if you've got a very sophisticated, very precise tracking mount, which can permit you to take very long exposures, you can set your ISO at 800 or 400, maybe even less. But if you don't have that kind of tracking mount, you're going to need to find ways to brighten your image as much as possible. And one of the ways you do that is by using a high ISO setting. I have found with my camera and with the equipment that I have that ISO 3200 works best. Now that seems to be the sweet spot given my camera and the equipment that I have. You might find out as you get into this that some other ISO might be your sweet spot, and you might wind up using 1600 or even something else. In my case, I take almost all of my photographs of deep sky objects using an ISO setting of 3200. Now, how do you set the ISO on your camera? It depends on the type and the model and the brand of camera you've got. In my case, I do it with the live view screen on the back of the camera here. Right here, I know you probably can't see this, but there's a place on here where you set your ISO setting. Very straightforward. You just simply choose what you want it to be, click OK, and that locks that ISO in for taking the picture. So that's ISO or ISO. Now, just to give you a brief, greatly simplified statement of how it works. When light comes into your camera, it hits your camera sensor in the form of light or photons. And those photons then are converted in your camera into electrical signals, which then produce the digital image that gets saved to your camera and represents your final picture. Now, if you have a high ISO setting or ISO setting, when the light strikes the sensor and starts to be converted into those electrical signals, those signals get amplified, and therefore your image becomes brighter. If you have a low ISO setting and you take a picture, the photons strike the sensor, they start to become converted to electrical signals, and they are dampened a little bit, thereby creating a darker image. So that's a very highly simplified explanation of how this works and what happens in there depending upon what your ISO setting is. Have two more comments to make about ISO before we move on here. There's a trade-off in using high ISOs, and there are two of them. The higher the ISO, the more noise gets introduced into your pictures. Now, that's not technically correct, but for all practical purposes, let's just put it that way. The noisier or more grainy, if you will, to use an old term from film days, your image is going to look as you choose higher ISOs. So expect a little bit more noise or graininess if you choose high ISOs and less if you choose lower ISOs. Changing the ISO setting on your camera is also going to affect the dynamic range of your camera or of the images it produces, dynamic range being essentially, the range between the darkest spot in your image and the lightest spot in your image, and with several different gradations or intervals in between those. That's dynamic range. The difference between the darkest spot and the brightest spot in your image. Now, as you set the ISO higher, it sort of shifts the dynamic range up or towards bright a little bit, so that what happens is you'll get more detail in the highlight portions of your image and less detail, maybe no detail at all, in the shadows or the dark portions of your image. And it works the other way as well. If you lower your ISO, that'll affect the dynamic range in such a way that you'll get less detail in the highlights and more detail in the shadows. Now, I've never been one to worry a whole lot about having some noise in my photograph or having little changes, as long as they're not extreme in the dynamic range. I'm not an expert or advanced or serious astrophotographer. I just want pictures that look like reasonable representations of these wonderful objects in the night sky. I don't mind some noise in my pictures. I don't worry a whole lot about whether or not I'm getting maximum possible detail in both the shadows and the highlights and those kind of things. That just doesn't bother me. And so, I don't worry about the effects of choosing ISO 3200 or even higher, unless the output is just really extreme, and then I might be concerned about it. But I don't know how you're going to feel about it, but I don't worry too much about those things. If I need 3200 to brighten up my image, I'm going to use that, even if it introduces a little noise into the image, and even if it shifts the dynamic range, towards bright a little bit. That's something that you'll decide on your own as you get into that. But those are the trade-offs that you make when you choose a high ISO setting for your camera. One other thing about ISO. DSLRs will sometimes have two additional ISO settings called high 1 and high 2. That's typically what they're called. They might be called something else on your camera, which you will learn from the instruction manual or whatever. But in my case, I have a high 1 and a high 2, which actually lets me raise my ISO all the way up to over 12,000. Now, sometimes you might have to do that. I mean, if you're shooting in extremely low light conditions, if you need that extra brightness in order to get an image that's even close to being decent, then you might have to go up to high 1 or high 2. But you need to be aware that these are not really true ISO settings. They are what you might call simulated ISO settings, and they will degrade significantly the quality of your image, and they are to be avoided unless you absolutely just have to have more brightness in your picture, in which case you might be forced to go to high 1 or high 2. But if you don't have to, best to stay away from those, because they will seriously degrade your image. Okay, ISO. A setting on your camera that allows you to change the brightness level of the image, and unless you've got a very expensive, precise tracking mount, you're probably going to want to take your pictures of dark sky objects with an ISO setting of somewhere around 1600 to 3200, at least as a starting point, and then you can decide which direction to go from that point. So, hope that made sense. Let's move on from ISO to the next very important thing we want to talk about, and that is shutter speed. Now, what is shutter speed? Well, it's very simple, actually, and here's my simple definition of shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter stays open when you take a picture. If you choose a fast shutter speed, the shutter will stay open much less time than if you choose a long shutter speed. Long shutter speeds stay open longer, allow more light to impact on the sensor of your camera. Fast shutter speeds, shutter stays open very briefly, less light impacts on the sensor of your camera. Now, you've obviously are probably thinking, and correctly so, that since we're going to be taking pictures of very dim objects against a black background, or a dark background, I should say, And since these objects are in motion or in apparent motion due to the rotation of the Earth, you're going to have to strike some kind of a balance between exposure and motion. You're going to be trying to take long exposure photographs of moving objects, and that's not easy to do, and you know, you have to understand the methods that you can use to do that. Shutter speed. A slow shutter speed will keep the shutter open longer, allow more light to come in. A fast shutter speed will keep the shutter open shorter and allow less light to come in. Obviously, when you're taking pictures of deep sky objects, dim objects against a dark background, you're going to want a long shutter speed, a long exposure. And you're going to want that to be as long as you can possibly manage. Let's talk about how you set shutter speed on your camera. There's a control on your camera that allows you to change shutter speed. I know you can't see this again, but right now this camera is set on 10 seconds. I can change that with this wheel right here in either direction. I have now taken it back to 1/5 of a second. I can go the other way, all the way up to 30 seconds. Now, that is usually the maximum specific shutter speed that you can set a DSLR for, but you can go longer than that by moving it up another step into so-called bulb mode. And when your camera is set in bulb mode, the shutter will stay open as long as the shutter release button is pressed. You can hold it down for as long as you want to, and that shutter will remain open and allow light to continue to accumulate or impact on the sensor of your camera, and you can use that to take very long exposures. So that's how you set the shutter speed. And you may have a different method on your camera. It'll be something very similar to this. And you'll be doing that, of course, again, with your camera in manual mode. Need the shutter speed, the exposure time to be set as long as possible so you can gather as much signal or as much light from this very dim object that you're trying to photograph. However, there is a very practical constraint on how long you can expose when you're taking a picture, and that depends basically on the sophistication of the mount that you're using, that you have your telescope mounted on. And we're going to talk about in the next video how to determine how long you can expose objects with different kinds of mounts, from very simple manual mounts all the way up to these very sophisticated, precise tracking mounts. So we're not going to get into that today. The idea that I want to leave you with in this video, that when you set the shutter speed setting on your camera, you want to set it at for the longest possible exposure that circumstances will allow. Now, why can't you set it for as long as you want to? Well, we've touched on it already. These objects in the sky are appearing to move because of the rotation of the Earth, and if you expose too long, you're going to start to get blurring in the image, and the stars in your images are going to start to be elongated, or star trails are going to start to develop due to the rotation of the Earth. And therefore you have to make sure that your exposure, the length of your exposure stops at that threshold where star trailing and blurring of the image becomes a problem due to rotation of the Earth. So in simple terms then, here's what it gets down to. You want to take your exposures as long as you possibly can without going over that threshold at which blurring and star trailing becomes an issue and starts to impact your pictures. So again, we're going to talk about what those shutter speeds should be depending upon what type of mount you're using. That's going to be covered in the next video, and I'm going to just stop right there by saying you want to expose as long as you possibly can without passing that threshold where star trailing becomes a problem. So aperture you don't have to worry about. ISO, unless you've got a very sophisticated tracking mount that will let you take very long exposures, you're going to want to set at 1600 or 3200 and then move up or down as you get some experience and you find the sweet spot there. And shutter speed, you want to have to be as long as possible without crossing that threshold where star trailing and blurring of the image is going to start to be a problem. So now, a couple other things about these DSLRs, and then we'll wrap this one up. You're not going to be using the viewfinder of your DSLR to take pictures through your telescope. That just is not going to work, just not feasible, it's just not possible. You're not going to be able to look through that little viewfinder and expect to do this. In fact, I have an insert in here covering up my viewfinder. That was an accessory that came with the camera when I bought it, and I have that in there to prevent any stray light from coming through the viewfinder and having any kind of an impact on the photographs that I'm taking. So how are you going to then monitor what's going on and how are you going to change your settings when you're trying to take pictures through your telescope? Well, you're going to do it in something called live view mode. DSLRs will typically have an LCD screen on the back of the camera. It'll either be attached to the back or it'll be mounted on a pivot arm that lets you swing it out and then rotate it up and down. That's just that can be very helpful in giving you a comfortable angle to view the screen. But in my case, it's just permanently affixed here to the back. If I turn that on, it comes on like that. And that's a live view mode, and that's going to show you what you're seeing through your camera and through your telescope. That's what you're going to use to compose your picture. That's what you're going to use to focus the object. That's what you're going to use as a means of monitoring when you change settings on your camera. And you're going to use this to look to get a playback and look at the pictures after you've taken them as well. So you will be using live view mode when you take pictures using a DSLR through a telescope, and that's just what you're going to be able to do. You're going to be able to monitor and do everything using that live view screen. Now, a couple of other issues, and then we'll call it quits. I strongly recommend that you set your camera to take pictures in RAW mode, RAW format, not JPEG format, not some other kind of format. There's a menu setting on your camera here, and on mine it's right here, which will give you an option to change just about everything associated with this DSLR. One of the items in there is image quality, and that will enable you to set it to take JPEG images. In some cases you can take two pictures, one JPEG and one RAW, and the other option is just RAW only. I recommend that you set your camera to take only RAW images. That'll give you a lot more data to work with when it comes time to edit your photographs, a lot more. And you just need to capture your images in RAW mode, and it's very important that you remember to set that before you start taking pictures. One of my most recent outings, I went out to try to take some photos of the Orion Nebula. I forgot to change the setting to from JPEG to RAW, and so I took a couple of hundred 10-second exposures of the Orion Nebula in JPEG form, only to get to the point where I wanted to stack these images together and bring them into a photo editor where I could edit that stacked image, and I found out that I was very limited in what I was able to do there because I took them in JPEG form instead of RAW format. I basically discarded those and started all over again using RAW images. So try to remember that if at all possible. Make sure that your image quality is set for RAW format, because those are going to give you the best quality final products. There's also a couple of other settings that you might want to consider changing in here. This camera, and I think most DSLRs, will be set to, can be set to show you the image that you've just taken on the screen here right after you've taken it. It will automatically display the picture you've just taken so that you can look at it and evaluate it and so forth. You're going to want to turn that off because you're going to be taking, as we're going to see in the next couple of videos, many photographs of the object that you're taking pictures of, one right after the other, in quick succession, in order to accumulate a bunch of individual photographs that you can combine into a single, much higher quality photograph for editing. And so in order to do that, you need to turn off the option that automatically displays the picture as soon as you take it. You'll be able to review those later on at your leisure, but you'll want to turn that off. You might also want to turn off the feature that cleans the sensor or cleans your camera after every photograph is taken. Just turn that off. That's going to interfere also with the process of taking many photographs one after the other, and you're not going to want that on. You can play around and look at all the other settings on your camera and pretty much decide using common sense whether there are others that you might want to turn off or leave on, but those are some that you definitely would want to consider. Set your image quality for RAW format, turn off the immediate view option, and probably turn off the option that cleans your camera after every photograph is taken. So, one other thing here that we want to mention, you're not going to be able to press the shutter release button to take your photographs. When you get your hands on this camera or any other part of your telescope, anything that you do, including pressing that shutter button, is going to introduce some vibration or movement into the system, and that's going to screw up your photographs. And you don't want to do that. So you're going to have some means of remotely triggering the shutter. Now the way I do it is with this thing. This is a remote shutter release cable, and you can get one of these for probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 or 12 US dollars. Very inexpensive. It will plug into your camera, in my case right here, and with that plugged in, I can now use this thing to trigger the shutter release, like that. You can have this stretch some distance from your camera. You never have to touch your camera or even get near to it. You're just going to take your pictures by using this. Now, this one has an option where I can lock it into place, and the camera will continue to take pictures according to whatever settings I have in place until I stop it automatically. Let me just show you briefly how that works. Maybe you can hear what's going on here. Taking one picture after another, and it won't stop until I release that button. Some people like to go a step further and use a device called an intervalometer, which costs about 30 or 40 US dollars. And you can program that intervalometer to tell it how many pictures you want to take, what the interval that you wish to have between pictures, and so forth. The process is the same, but you have more control over it, and you can program it in advance and just walk away from it then until it's finished doing its thing. So you will need some means of remotely triggering your shutter. Otherwise, any movement caused by touching your camera in any way, especially by triggering that shutter release, is going to cause unwanted vibration and mess up your pictures. So you will need to use something like that. Let's stop right there. Just review very quickly. Make sure that your camera is set in manual mode, and by whatever means your camera accomplishes that. Make sure it's set in manual mode. You don't have to be concerned about setting aperture. There's no way to set aperture because you're not going to have a lens attached to your camera. Your camera is going to be attached to the telescope. ISO, unless you've got an extremely sophisticated tracking mount that will let you take very long exposures, you're going to want to set your ISO probably at 1600 or 3200 and then experiment a little bit to find out where your sweet spot is and go from there. Avoid using high 1 or high 2 or high settings if possible. And set your shutter speed to take as long an exposure as you possibly can without going past that threshold of waiting too long so that blurring or star trailing starts to develop. And again, we're going to discuss how to determine those shutter speeds in the next video. You want to take pictures in RAW format. You'll be using your live view screen to monitor and control everything. You will need a shutter release cable in order to remotely trigger your shutter so that you don't have to touch the camera or the telescope while you're in process of taking photographs. I hope that was semi-lucid. I tried to be. You will have no doubt judged by now that I probably don't know as much about all of this as others do, and that would be true. I make no claim to be an expert or even advanced or serious astrophotographer, as I've said many times on these videos. You may know more about what we've just discussed than I do, and if you do, that's wonderful. But I've tried to explain some of the basics of some of the settings that you'll be concerned with when you use a DSLR to take pictures through a telescope. I encourage you to seek out other YouTube channels or other internet sources or other sources of information that will perhaps explain in more detail things like ISO and shutter speed and the settings that you need to make on your camera and how you go about all of that. You can get a lot more definitive, more detailed information, probably presented in a better and more comprehensible way in other places. I encourage you to look into this more and learn more about this so that you can be comfortable with knowing how you're going to use your DSLR to take pictures through your telescope. So, let's wrap this one up. We'll be back next time when we're going to talk about how to determine how to set your shutter speed. And until then, let me thank you all so very much for watching. And as always, let me wish you clear skies. And by the way, I hope you're having clearer skies than I am. Had a really bad run of cloudy nights. I had a good one last night. A very clear, bright night. A very cold one, but very clear and very bright. I took advantage of it and went out and got some practice at using my new little refracting telescope and had a great time doing so. So anyway, my wish for you is that you might experience clear skies and good viewing, and I'll see you next time.